Hi, here we're going to take a look at basic classical genetics, and we're going to take a look at how these things called risk factors might make it more likely for some folks to get certain diseases. And so specifically, here are the things that we're going to be taking a look at in this video. If you want to pause the video here and take a closer look at these questions that you should be able to answer, then go ahead and do that right now. Otherwise, we're going to go and jump right in. So the first thing we're going to take a look at, and this you'll see how this relates to classical genetics a little bit later on in this video, but the first thing we're going to take a look at are the two general ways that living things can reproduce. One way that things can reproduce is the simplest way that things can reproduce, and it basically just involves the cell splitting in half to produce two cells. So it turns out that my boys, the bacteria, are an example of a living thing that divides in this way, that reproduces in this way. And basically when this type of reproduction happens, it involves, so this represents a cell, and then this represents the DNA or the genetic material inside of that cell. So in this type of reproduction, what happens basically is that the genetic material inside of that cell makes a copy of itself, so the DNA copies itself. Then the cell basically just divides in half right between where those two pieces of DNA are. And so when that happens, you end up with two cells from the original one cell. Each one of these two cells are genetically identical to one another, so they're going to have the same exact information on their DNA as they do compared to one another. And they're both going to be identical to that one parent cell, this one that produced those two offspring cells. So that's one really easy way that some living things reproduce, is just by basically copying everything inside of it and then splitting in half. Another general way that living things reproduce is by combining genetic information. And so this is how organisms like us, human beings, reproduce. And so with this type of reproduction, you have two individuals, each one producing reproductive cells. So the reproductive cells of females are called egg cells, and the reproductive cells of males are called sperm cells. And what happens with this type of reproduction is that those two reproductive cells come together. In this case, the sperm cell basically is going to deliver the genetic information that it carries over to that egg cell. And so this egg cell now contains genetic information from two parents, one from the mother, one from the father. This is then what ends up dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing to produce eventually a little baby. So again, two general ways that living things can reproduce. One way involves just a cell splitting in half, and when you're talking about that type of reproduction, that's called asexual reproduction. Again, that's when one parent cell divides to form offspring cells or daughter cells. And the thing about asexual reproduction is that the new cells that are produced are genetically identical to that one parent cell that produced them. Another way of saying that is that the two offspring cells that are produced are clones of the one parent cell that produced them. The other general type of reproduction that occurs is something called sexual reproduction. And so one of the things that makes sexual reproduction different, or the thing that makes it different, is that instead of having one parent cell, there are two parents that are involved in this type of reproduction. And so what happens is that two parents combine genetic information with each other to form offspring, which means that if you consider the genetic information found in the offspring, it's actually a combination of the two parents. One term that's associated with reproduction of living things is chromosome, and basically a chromosome is a chunk of DNA that contains genetic information on it. So in this drawing here, all of these things, so this and this represents the chromosome of each one of these two cells, and then here are chromosomes that are found in this one cell that's going to become the baby. And so this is another difference between asexual, or this can be another difference between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And a lot of organisms that reproduce asexually, like bacteria, they only contain one chromosome each inside of those cells, whereas if you consider living things that reproduce sexually, the cells that make up those organisms are going to have multiple chromosomes inside of them. And so what we're going to do next is say a little bit more about exactly what these things called chromosomes are. So what are chromosomes? Well, let's relate this back to something we talked about before. Before we talked about a molecule called DNA. It's made up of a bunch of nucleotides attached to one another. And remember that DNA is made up of two nucleic acid chains that are connected to one another to form kind of a ladder structure like you see here. We mentioned before that DNA has a lot of information on it, and all of that information can be divided into smaller packets called genes. And specifically what each one of these genes can do is that they can be used, or they can be transcribed to make a molecule called RNA. That RNA can then undergo something called translation to produce a protein. So that's what all of the genes on the DNA do, is that they all encode for some sort of protein that's going to have a really important function inside of that cell. It turns out though that in a lot of cell types, the DNA isn't just one long continuous molecule like you see here. Instead, in a lot of cells, the DNA is separated up into chunks, kind of like this. And so each one of these chunks of DNA that can contain up to thousands of different genes on them, that's what a chromosome is. And so again, in sexually reproducing organisms, the cells that make up those living things are going to have multiple chromosomes in the nucleus. Whereas in a lot of asexually reproducing organisms like bacteria, they're only going to have one chunk of DNA or one chromosome inside of that cell. All right, so again, what are chromosomes? It's a piece of DNA that is needed for a cell's survival. So if you take away the chromosomal DNA from a cell, that cell would not be able to survive. It would not be able to make all of the proteins that it needs to stay alive. Another thing about chromosomes is that each one can contain up to thousands of different genes on there. And also different organisms can have different numbers of chromosomes. So we mentioned that bacteria, for example, if you take a look inside of a bacterial cell, it's just going to have one piece of chromosomal DNA inside of it. On the other hand, if you consider human cells, the vast majority of them are going to have 23 chromosomes inside of them. But again, most of them have not just one set, but two sets of 23 chromosomes inside of them. So 2 times 23 means that most human cells have 46 total chromosomes inside of them. And so we'll spend some time here in a minute talking about what we mean by 2 sets of 3 chromosomes. Just wanted to mention that human cells, most of them have 2 sets of 23 chromosomes inside of them for a total of 46. The only exception, so the only human cells that do not have a total of 46 chromosomes are the reproductive cells. So human egg cells and human sperm cells, and instead of having 2 sets of 23 chromosomes inside of them, 2 sets of 23 chromosomes inside of them, they only have 1 set of 23 chromosomes inside of them. So another way of saying this is that human reproductive cells, so egg cells and sperm cells, have a total of 23 chromosomes inside of them, whereas all of the other cells in the body have 2 sets of 23 chromosomes for a total of 46 chromosomes inside of their nuclei. So what we're going to do next is spend a little bit more time explaining this. So what exactly do we mean when we say that most human cells have 2 sets of 23 chromosomes for a total of 46? Well, if you take a look at the nucleus, or inside the nucleus of most human cells, what you'll see is this: chunks of DNA. Remember, each chunk of DNA is called a chromosome. Each chromosome can have hundreds or thousands of genes on there. So what I'm showing you here are 23 different chromosomes that you find inside the nucleus of a human cell. But what I'm saying here is that human cells, most of them don't have just one set of 23 chromosomes. Instead, there are actually 2 sets of 23 chromosomes inside of most human cells. And so another way of saying this is that you have 2 of each chromosome inside of most of your cells. Again, the only exception being egg and sperm cells, which only have 1 of each chromosome. And so you might be asking yourself, well, why do we have 2? Why do most of our cells have 2 of each chromosome? How did that happen? Well, remember that humans are sexually reproducing organisms. And so that's the reason why most of our cells have 2 of each chromosome inside of them in their nucleus. Right? So if you remember with sexual reproduction, what happens is that one individual produces a reproductive cell, another individual produces a reproductive cell. Each reproductive cell has genetic material inside of it. In other words, each reproductive cell has a set of chromosomes inside of them. And so when they come together, so when that sperm fertilizes the egg, that sperm is delivering all of its chromosomes to the egg. So it's adding all of its chromosomes to the chromosomes that are already found in the egg. So this fertilized egg now, or this zygote, now has 2 of each chromosome. And so that's what divides and divides and divides again to eventually produce a baby. And so most of the cells in this baby are going to have 2 of each chromosome. One set of chromosomes it got from its mother, and then the other set of chromosomes it got from its father. Right? So then that's a really key point here. So all human cells, except for the reproductive cells, have 2 sets of 23 chromosomes, and the reason why we have 2 of every chromosome is because we reproduce sexually. So one of these sets of chromosomes comes from the mother, and the other set of chromosomes comes from the father. So in this picture here, it's color-coded. So all of the blue chromosomes are ones that were inherited from the father, and all of the pink chromosomes were ones that were inherited from the mother. Now all of the chromosomes inside of cells are given designations. So if you take a look at all of the different chromosomes inside of a human cell, you'll see that they've actually physically look different from one another. So some chromosomes are shorter than others, some of them are thicker than others, some of them have more genes than other chromosomes. So there are actually physical differences that you can see between all of the chromosomes that you find inside of a cell. So again, each one of the chromosomes are given designations so that we can kind of tell them apart from one another. So it turns out that one of the chromosomes inside of human cells is just designated chromosome number 1. And remember, that's because we are sexually reproducing organisms, that means we have 2 of each chromosome. So we have, or each person has 2 chromosome number 1s in most of their cells. Another one of the chromosomes inside of the nucleus is just designated chromosome number 2. And again, because we are sexually reproducing organisms, we have 2 chromosome number 2s in all of our cells except for the reproductive cells. There's a chromosome in the nucleus that's just designated chromosome number 3, and again, because we are sexually reproducing organisms, we have 2 chromosome number 3s in all of our cells except for the egg and the sperm. And that's the case for the rest of the chromosomes inside of our cells. They're all just given a number designation, and again, because we are sexually reproducing organisms, because all of us have both a mother and a father, that means that we're going to have 2 of each one of those chromosomes. So the designations for all of these chromosomes are pretty straightforward, right? They're just given a number, 1 through 22. That 23rd pair of chromosomes, though, is considered to be special. It's a little bit different than the rest of the chromosomes, so the way that they're designated is not just by a number. So this last pair of chromosomes here they're not called chromosome number 23. Instead, they are referred to as the sex chromosomes. And the reason why these chromosomes are called sex chromosomes is because they contain a lot of genes that have something to do with determining the gender of an individual. And so instead of being given number designations, sex chromosomes are given letter designations. And so if someone inherits from their father a type of sex chromosome called the X chromosome, and if they also inherited an X chromosome from their mother, that's what results in someone being biologically female, by having 2 X chromosomes, one that, again, they inherited from their father, and then one that they inherited from their mother. On the other hand, in individuals who are biologically male, here's what you would see for their sex chromosomes inside of their cells. For individuals who are biologically male, you'll see that from their mother they inherited a type of a sex chromosome, again called the X chromosome. But from their father they inherited a type of sex chromosome called a Y chromosome. So individuals who have X and Y for their sex chromosomes would be considered biologically male. And so here you see another thing that makes the sex chromosomes different than all of the other chromosome pairs that you find inside of the cell, or at least of human cells. So you see that all of these other pairs, the 2 chromosomes in that pair, look very similar to one another, right? They're similar in size and in shape and in thickness and the number of genes that they contain. So for example here, the chromosome number 1 that someone inherits from their father is just going to physically look basically the same, very similar to the chromosome number 1 that they inherit from their mother. And that's the case for all of the other chromosomes. The only exception is again with the sex chromosomes. So if someone happens to inherit this combination of sex chromosomes, X and Y, you'll see that these 2 chromosomes do not look physically similar to one another. So in fact, the X chromosome is quite a bit larger than the Y chromosome. And it turns out that there's a hypothesis out there that says that the Y chromosome, that the way that it evolved is that it originally was an X chromosome, but it became kind of shrunken over time. So it lost some of the genes that you typically find on the X chromosome. So again, if you're to take a look at the nucleus of all human cells except for the egg and the sperm, basically this is what you would expect to find in there. 2 sets of 23 chromosomes, and one of those pairs of chromosomes is kind of a special pair, and they're called sex chromosomes, and those are the chromosomes that are largely involved in determining gender. So some other important points I wanted to add here is this. Each chromosome contains multiple genes. We've mentioned that already. So chromosomes can contain hundreds or thousands of genes on them, each one. And remember from before that when we're talking about genes, what genes do is that it's a packet of information that encodes for a particular type of protein. And it turns out that proteins can be responsible for different traits that you find in an individual. So for example, there's a type of protein called melanin. It's a pigment protein, and that plays a big role in determining the skin tone trait. Another thing to point out about chromosomes is that each chromosome contains different genes on them. So for example, we mentioned that there's a chromosome in human cells that's just designated chromosome number 1. And so if you consider the chromosome number 1 of every human being out there, all chromosome number 1s have a gene on there that encodes for a protein called collagen. And so you might have heard of collagen before. Collagen is a structural protein that you find in the skin and other connective tissue in the body. Everyone's chromosome number 1 also contains a gene that encodes for a type of antibody that protects us against certain types of bacteria and viruses. So again, whenever you're talking about human chromosome number 1, everyone's chromosome number 1 is going to have defined set of genes on there. So again, for example, we know that everyone's chromosome number 1 has these 2 genes on there. Remember that because we are sexually reproducing organisms, we have 2 parents. That means that we actually have 2 chromosome number 1s. So on the chromosome number 1 that was inherited from the mother, it's also going to have those 2 genes on there. The gene that encodes for the structural protein called collagen, and also this gene that encodes for a type of antibody that protects us against bacteria and viruses. We're saying here that each chromosome contains different genes. So if you consider, say, chromosome number 15, it's going to have a different set of genes on there. So an example of a gene that is known to be located on chromosome number 15 is the gene that encodes for a protein called melanin, which you've just mentioned. And again, what melanin is, it's a protein that acts as a pigment. And so individuals who have the genes for making a lot of melanin would have a darker skin tone. Those who don't have genes for making a lot of melanin would have a lighter skin tone. So it turns out that melanin, this is the pigment that is not only involved or not only responsible for skin tone, but also hair color and eye color as well. Another gene that's known to be found on everybody's chromosome number 15 is a gene that encodes for a protein that regulates brain size. So this is a gene that plays a role during development. So when there's an embryo that's developing inside the mother's womb, this is the gene that determines whether that embryo's brain is going to develop into the appropriate size that's needed to be alive once that embryo has become a baby and is outside of the mother's womb. So again, these are 2 known genes that are known to be found on everybody's chromosome number 15. Because we are sexually reproducing organisms, that means we have a mother and a father, which means that we have 2 chromosome number 15. So not only do we have the chromosome number 15 that we got from our mother, but we also have the chromosome number 15 that we got from our father. So because we have 2 chromosome number 15s, that means we have 2 of each one of these genes. So this chromosome number 15 that was inherited from the father also has the gene for melanin, and also has the gene that encodes for the protein that regulates brain size in embryos. Some other things to point out about these chromosomes is that the genes that, we already mentioned this, genes that determine gender are largely found on the sex chromosomes, which is not to say that sex chromosomes contain only those kinds of genes. Right, so genes that are responsible for determining gender are found on the sex chromosomes, but sex chromosomes contain other genes as well. For example, the gene that allows someone to tell the difference between the color red and the color green, that gene is found on the sex chromosomes. So again, sex chromosomes are unique because they have a lot of genes on there that determine gender, but that's not the only type of gene that you find on sex chromosomes. So maybe it might be more appropriate to call them sex and more chromosomes, because they do more than just determining gender. And then lastly, there's this term that I wanted to share. It's this term called autosome. So we mentioned that there are 23 pairs of chromosomes that you find in the nucleus of cells. One of those pairs is given a special designation. They're called sex chromosomes. So then you might be wondering, well, what are these other pairs of chromosomes called? And so if they're not sex chromosomes, then they're considered to be autosomes. And so an autosome is just any chromosome that you find in the nucleus of a human cell that is not a sex chromosome. So if you consider all of the chromosomes inside of this nucleus, this is a sex chromosome, this is a sex chromosome. All of these other chromosomes that are not the sex chromosome, those are called autosomes. So chromosome number 1 is an autosome, number 2 is an autosome. So all of them up to number 22, those are all considered to be autosomes. So now that we know all of this stuff about chromosomes, if we go back and revisit what happens whenever a sperm fertilizes an egg, we can draw out a more complete picture of how that happens. So when human sperm fertilizes a human egg, it looks more like this. Remember that reproductive cells, like eggs, only have one set of chromosomes inside of them. So all human egg cells look like this. They're going to have 22 chromosomes inside of them, or 22 autosomes, and then a single sex chromosome. And it turns out that all human egg cells have the X sex chromosome inside of them. Sperm cells are going to likewise have just one set of chromosomes. So there's going to be a total of 22 chromosomes, or 22 autosomes inside of a sperm cell. And for its sex chromosome, it's going to have either an X chromosome or a Y chromosome inside of it. So depending on whether the sperm cell that fertilizes this egg has an X or Y chromosome in it, that's what's going to determine what gender this embryo and this baby is going to have, what biological gender it's going to have. So for example, say that the sperm that's going to fertilize this egg happens to be one that has the X chromosome inside of it. When that happens, when that sperm fertilizes that egg, it's going to deliver all of its genetic content, so all 22 of its autosomes, and then its one X chromosome is going to join with the genetic material that's already found inside of that egg. And when that happens, you end up with the total number of 46 chromosomes that you're going to find in most of this baby's cells. So 22 plus 22 is 44. Here's the 45th chromosome, and then here's the 46th chromosome. Because this embryo has two X chromosomes for its sex chromosomes, it's going to end up being biologically female. On the other hand, if the sperm that fertilizes this egg happens to be a sperm that has the Y chromosome inside of it, what that fertilization is going to look like is this. So that sperm is going to deliver all of its genetic content to that egg. So it's going to join in with the genetic information that's already inside of that egg. You end up with that familiar total number of 46 chromosomes that you're going to find inside of most human cells. 22 from the mother plus 22 from the father gives you 44 total chromosomes, plus a 45th chromosome and the 46th chromosome. And so because this embryo has both an X and a Y chromosome, it's going to develop into a baby that will be biologically male. Alright, so then bringing us back to this picture of all of the chromosomes that you find inside of the nucleus of a human cell, I wanted to share a couple more terms that will come in handy when it comes to describing what's happening inside of a cell, and it'll also come in handy later when we start describing what happens with inheritance in classical genetics. So one of those terms is homologous pair of chromosomes. And what a homologous pair of chromosomes is that there are chromosomes that have the same genes on them. And again, the reason why you have chromosomes that have the same genes on them is because for each chromosome that you inherit, for each chromosome that you get one from your mother, and then you get one from your father. And so you see in this drawing here, you see that this person has two chromosome number 1s. We mentioned that each one of these chromosome number 1s, the one that was inherited from the mother, has these two genes on there in addition to some other genes, but these are the two that we identified. And the chromosome number 1 that was inherited from the mother also has those same two genes on there. So then these would be considered a pair of homologous chromosomes because they have the same genes on them. These two would be considered a homologous pair of chromosomes. These two would be considered a homologous pair of chromosomes. 7 and 7 would be considered a homologous pair of chromosomes. So again, the reason why we have homologous pairs of each chromosome, the reason why we have two of each chromosome, is because for each chromosome that we get one from our father and one from our mother. One thing about homologous chromosomes, though, is this. So we already mentioned that by definition, homologous chromosomes have the same genes on them. But they don't necessarily have to have the same version of each gene. So to show you what I mean by this, let's key in on this pair of homologous chromosomes here. So let's key in on the two chromosome number 15s that someone can inherit. So we're going to take these two chromosome number 15s, make them bigger. We mentioned that one of the genes that you find on chromosome number 15 is the gene that encodes for this protein. It's a pigment protein called melanin. And so melanin can actually have different types of colors to them, but one type of melanin has kind of a brownish color to it. Because we have two chromosome number 15s, not only do we have one gene that encodes for melanin, but we have two genes that encode for melanin. And again, that's what makes these two chromosomes homologous pairs, is because they both have the same genes on them. In this case, they both have the gene that encodes for this pigment protein called melanin. What we're saying here, though, is that even though this homologous pair of chromosomes have the same gene on them, they don't necessarily have to be the same version of that gene. So there's a slightly different version of this melanin gene that encodes for a slightly different looking melanin protein. So this slightly different version of the melanin gene encodes for a melanin protein that actually has no color to it. So this is kind of considered to be a mutant version of the melanin gene. So what we're saying here is that each person has two chromosome number 15s. It's possible, though, that the chromosome number 15 that was inherited from the father has a version of the melanin gene that encodes for a functioning melanin pigment protein, one that has a color to it. But in this case, this person from the mother inherited a chromosome number 15 that has a version of the melanin gene on it that encodes for a slightly different version of that melanin pigment protein. So this version of the melanin protein has no color to it. So again, this is what I mean when I say that by definition, homologous chromosomes have the same genes on them. So in this case, this chromosome number 15 has the gene for producing melanin, which means that here, because this is the homologous pair, this is also going to have the gene that encodes for melanin on it. But these two genes can be slightly different versions compared to one another, with one producing a version of the melanin protein that has a color and the other one producing a version of the melanin protein that has no color to it. Another possibility is that someone could inherit a chromosome number 15 from the father that has the version of the melanin gene on it that encodes for the colorless melanin pigment protein. And so if this is the pair of chromosome number 15s that someone happened to inherit from their parents, if you take a look at their actual skin tone, it's going to be a lot lighter compared to someone who inherited these versions of the melanin gene from their parents. Alright, so then that brings us to the term that I wanted to share with you here. And that term is allele. So an allele is just a version of a gene. So those two terms can be used interchangeably. So whenever you see allele in a sentence, if you swap it out with version of a gene, then that sentence might make more sense if you're not sure what allele means. So again, using this new term in our situation that we've just described here, we're saying that there are two different versions of the gene that encodes for melanin. There's the version that encodes for the functioning melanin protein that has a color to it, and there's the version that encodes for the non-functioning melanin protein that has no color to it. So another way of saying that there are two different versions of the melanin gene is to say that there are two different alleles for the melanin gene. So there is the dark melanin version, or the dark melanin allele, and then also the light melanin allele. So again, if you're ever unsure about what this term allele means, just swap in this phrase, version of a gene, into that part of the sentence and it should make more sense. Some other terms that kind of go along with allele is this term heterozygous. So if someone is heterozygous for a gene, this prefix hetero means different. So if someone is heterozygous for a gene, that means that the alleles inherited from the mom and dad are different. And so that's what you happen to see right here. Is you can say that this person is heterozygous for the melanin gene because the allele, or the version of that gene that they got from their father, is different from the allele, or the version of the gene that they inherited from their mother. The other option, besides being heterozygous for a gene, is being homozygous for a gene. So this prefix homo means the same. So if someone is homozygous for a gene, it means that the alleles that they inherited from mom and dad are the same. So if someone is homozygous for the melanin gene, then here's what you would see. Here's one option for what someone would look like with their chromosome number 15. If they're homozygous for this gene, is that they inherited the same version, in this case the dark melanin version, or the dark melanin allele from both dad and mom. Another way that someone could be homozygous for this gene is if they inherited this combination here. So again, both of these versions are the same, but in this case they're the same because they are both the allele, or the version that encodes for the non-colored melanin protein. Some other terms that people commonly use when they're talking about genetics in terms of alleles and heterozygous and homozygous are these terms right here. Well, actually these aren't terms, but just a concept. So it turns out that letter symbols may be used to represent the different alleles, or the different versions that you find for a gene. And by convention, the same letter is used for the same gene. So I'll show you the rules here and then I'll explain what those mean. Capital letters are used to represent the allele that produces the functional version of the protein, and lowercase letters are used to represent the allele that produces the non-functional version of the protein. So in this case, you see that we're taking a look at just one gene. So this is the gene that, again, encodes for the melanin protein. We see that there are actually two different versions, or two different alleles for that gene. Well, let me back up and say that because we're taking a look at just one gene here, the one that encodes for melanin, you would use one letter to represent that gene. So For example, someone might choose the letter M to represent the gene that encodes for melanin. But you can use the capital version, or a capital M and a lowercase m, to represent these two different alleles. So typically the allele that encodes for the functioning version of the protein is represented by the capital version of that letter, and the allele that encodes for the non-functioning version of that protein is represented by the lowercase version of that same letter. And again, so this is the same gene that we're taking a look at here, the gene that encodes for melanin. That's why you want to use the same letter for each one of those genes. It's just that the capital version represents one version of that gene, and the lowercase version represents the other version of that gene. Some other terms that are commonly used when talking about genetics are these terms here. So I'll show you the definitions and then I'll explain what those mean. There's this term genotype, and what genotype refers to, well, what that means is which gene versions someone has, or what collection of alleles someone has inherited. And with sexually reproducing organisms, because we have both a mother and a father, whenever you're talking about genotype, or whenever you're describing genotype, it's going to always consist of two letters for the same gene, right? Because we inherit two of each gene, one from our mother, one from our fathers. And another term is phenotype. So phenotype is a description of the actual observable trait that results from the genotype that someone inherits. So in this example here, if you're talking about this trait that is responsible for skin color, if you want to know what is this person's genotype for the skin color trait, well, the genotype describes the actual alleles that this person has inherited. So in this case here, this person inherited the allele that encodes for the functioning melanin protein from their father, and the allele that encodes for the non-functional melanin protein from their mother. So when you're describing the actual alleles that this person inherited, in other words, when you're describing their genotype, you would say that their genotype is big M, little m. In other words, they are heterozygous for this trait. And when you're describing the phenotype, or the actual observable trait, the medium type in this case, you could say something like medium dark skin. If someone happened to have this genotype, so if someone inherited the small m version from one parent and the small m version from the other parent, right, neither one of these alleles can encode for the functioning colored pigment protein. So because this person would be incapable of producing any of these pigment proteins, you could say that their actual phenotype, or their actual observable trait, would be described as light skin. And then on the other hand, if someone's genotype is this, so if they inherited from one parent the allele that produces the functioning colored pigment protein, and then the same allele from their other parent, you could say that that genotype produces the phenotype of very dark skin. So again, genotype is just a description of which alleles someone inherited for a particular gene, and then phenotype is a description of what trait you actually observe as a result of inheriting that particular genotype. Now, one of the things you can do if you know the genotypes of two individuals who are going to have kids with one another is to predict the chances that their offspring will have certain genotypes and certain phenotypes. So to show you how we can do this, I'll just work through an example with you. So I'll just leave this picture up here on the screen just to remind us what the terms allele and heterozygous and homozygous and genotype and phenotype mean. And so in this example, let's do this. So suppose that a big M, little m individual plans on having a child with an individual whose genotype is little m, little m. If that happens, what are the chances that the child will have a big M genotype? What are the chances that the child will have a small m genotype? And what are the chances that the child will have a big M, small m genotype? What are the chances that the child will be heterozygous for this trait? So to figure this out, what you can do is set up something called a Punnett square. And basically what a Punnett square is, it's a chart that you can set up that will let you visualize all the possibilities as far as what the potential offspring could have for genotypes and phenotypes based off what alleles you would expect to have, or what alleles you would expect to find in the reproductive cells of the two parents. So let's do this. In this problem here, it says that a big M, little m individual is going to mate with a little m individual. So typically the way that's written out in shorthand is like this. You have a big M, little m individual who's going to mate with, or who's going to cross with a little m individual. So someone with a heterozygous genotype mating with someone who has the homozygous genotype, homozygous for the small m allele. And so for this type of Punnett square, you want to set up a Punnett square that has 4 smaller squares inside of it, kind of like this. And along the top edge of the Punnett square, you're going to want to put the genes that you would expect to find in the reproductive cells of one of the parents. So let's do this parent here for the top edge of the Punnett square. Whenever someone with a big M, little m genotype makes reproductive cells, half of that person's reproductive cells are going to have the big M allele in it. And then the other half of that person's reproductive cells are going to have the little m allele in it. So remember that reproductive cells only have one of each chromosome, or one set of everything in it. That means that it's only going to have one allele, one of each allele inside of it. So we show that on the Punnett square by doing this. So again, this individual here, half of this person's reproductive cells are going to have the big M allele in it, and then the other half of this person's reproductive cells are going to have the little m allele in it. So again, what these letters represent, one big letter M and one small letter m, are the reproductive cells that this individual produces. And then along the left-hand side, or the left edge of this Punnett square, you would write down letters that represent the alleles that you would expect to find in the reproductive cells that the other parent would make. So if you consider this parent right here, or this individual right here, when this individual makes reproductive cells, half of the reproductive cells this person makes is going to have this little m in it, and the other half of this person's reproductive cells are going to have this little m in it. So in other words, this first letter m here would get put on this part of the Punnett square, and then this letter m over here would get put over here. So I guess just to make this complete, what we did for the other parent is that we put one of his alleles, or one of this person's alleles, over here, and then this other allele, the small m, that this individual has, is going to go over here. And so again, basically what we've created here is a chart. These are all of the reproductive cells, or these represent all of the reproductive cells that this person could possibly produce, and then these two letters represent all of the possible reproductive cells that this person could produce. So then what happens if this reproductive cell happens to get together with this reproductive cell? What would the genotype of the resulting offspring be? Well, it would be this. It would be the big M that this reproductive cell is going to bring, together with the small m that this reproductive cell is going to bring. So what do we have over here? What if, when these two individuals mate, this is the reproductive cell from one of the individuals that happens to get together with this reproductive cell from the other individual? So if that were the case, what would be the genotype of the resulting offspring? It would just be this small letter m together with this small letter m from the other parent. Now what would happen if this is the reproductive cell that happens to get together with this reproductive cell? What would be the genotype of the resulting offspring? Well, it would be this big letter m getting together with this small letter m from the other parent. And then the last square is this. So what would happen if this happens to be the sperm that ends up fertilizing this egg from the other parent? What would be the resulting genotype of the offspring? It would just be this small letter m from the one parent's sperm cell getting together with this small letter m from the other parent's egg cell. So now that we've completed this Punnett square, we can see all the possible different genotypes that this particular mating could produce. And not only that, but we can see what the chances are that a particular genotype would be produced. So that means that we can go back and answer these questions right here. So what are the chances that a child produced by this mating would have a big M genotype? So if we take a look at our Punnett square, we see that there are no offspring that have the big M genotype. So 0 out of the 4 possibilities here means that with this particular mating that there is a 0% chance of producing an offspring that has the big M genotype. About this question here, what are the chances that this mating will produce a child that has the small m genotype? If we take a look at our Punnett square, we see that there are 2 small m's, one up here and one up here. In other words, this is telling us that there is a 2 out of 4 chance that whenever these two have a child, that child will have that small m genotype. So what are the chances that the child will have a small m genotype? There is a 2 in 4 chance, which equals 50%. And then what are the chances that a child from this mating will have a big M genotype? In other words, what are the chances that they will produce a heterozygous child? So if we go back to our Punnett square, we see that there are, or out of the 4 possibilities, there are 2 big M combinations that we see here. So what are the chances that this mating will produce a big M genotype? there is a 2 in 4 chance, which again equals 50%. So again, what these numbers tell you is that every time these two individuals have a child, there is no chance that they will produce a child with a big M genotype. Every time they have a child, there is a 50% chance that that child will have the small m genotype. And every time this couple has a child, there is a 50% chance that that child will have the big M small m genotype. Now, together with this, you can also ask questions about the possibility or the likelihood of getting different phenotypes. And you can ask that question because we know what the likelihood of getting the corresponding genotypes are. So for example, you could ask things like, what are the chances that this couple will have a child that has the dark skin phenotype? And we know that the genotype that produces the dark skin phenotype is big M, because big M means that this person has two alleles, and both of those alleles produce the functioning colored version of the melanin protein. So they would be producing a lot of dark color that would then produce the dark skin phenotype. So because we know that the dark skin phenotype is produced by the big M genotype, and because we know that there is a 0% chance that this couple will produce a child that has the big M genotype, we know then that there is a 0% chance that this couple will produce a child that has the dark skin phenotype. And I guess we can go down the list. We could also ask things like, what are the chances that this couple will have a child and that child will have the light skin phenotype? Because we know that the light skin phenotype is produced by the small m genotype, and because we know that this couple would have a 50% chance of producing a child that has a small m genotype, that tells us that there is a 50% chance that this couple will produce a child that has the light skin phenotype. Then we can ask, what are the chances that this child will produce, or that this couple will produce a child that has the medium skin tone phenotype? We know that the medium skin tone phenotype is produced by this genotype right here, the heterozygous one, big M small m. And because we figured out that there is a 50% chance that this couple will produce a big M small m genotype in their offspring, that tells us that there is a 50% chance that they will produce a child that has the medium skin phenotype. Right, so again, if you know the genotypes of the parents, you can use that information to predict the chances that their offspring will have certain genotypes and certain phenotypes, like we showed you here.